Hey everybody. Had the mandolin out from the introduction, so I thought I'd do another little bit. Anyway, I wanted to record a little mini lecture here. The question of this mini lecture is something you might wonder. What is the beginning of British literature, and what does that even mean? There's lots of stories I could tell, but I'm just going to tell one or two as a way of answering this question. Not the only way to answer this question. Another question that might influence this one is, what is British literature? What is the difference between British literature and English literature for the purpose of this course? These are all good questions, but today I'm going to focus mostly on the beginning, and I'm trying out this sort of ghetto way of having my face and some images on the screen at the same time, so bear with me if this isn't the most legible medium. I'll probably get better at these videos as we go. First, I wanted to mention that the beginning that we're taking in this course is the beginning that most courses in British literature take, or at least the text that most courses in British literature use is the beginning, and that's Beowulf. Beowulf's a very strange work to call the beginning of British literature, or to assign as the earliest. Many of you may have read it in some shape or form, and you would know that Beowulf is a hero from a place called Geatland, which is in Sweden, and the poem is about Beowulf journeying from Geatland to Denmark to fight some monsters that have been troubling a Danish king. We don't know how long this poem was being sung or in what places, but we do know, or we can guess, that the poem was written down about 1000, the year 1000 in England, maybe in East Anglia from the dialect of the poem. That's a very strange coincidence because at about this time in England, the English were a new nation, and they were busy fighting for their life against armies being sent from Denmark, who were trying to incorporate England into the empire of a king named Canute the Great. So it's a very strange circumstance to have an epic poem written in English about a Geatish hero fighting wars for the Danes at a time of an existential crisis against the Danes. But that's not even the earliest poem that we can really put a date to in English, much less British. So it doesn't really help us in the question of when does British literature begin, or what is the beginning of British literature. Britain, the island, first enters something like a historical record, a textual record, with the invasion of Julius Caesar, BC. Now I don't even remember the date, 56? Wikipedia everything I say, because I'm often just pulling numbers off the top of my head. At that point, there was no English speaker on the island. There were probably Celtic speakers speaking something like Welsh and the mysterious language known as Pictish. No, it took about 500 years for people speaking the sort of elemental form of English to come to the island after the Romans bailed out. When they needed their legions somewhere else, they sort of pulled out of their colony in Britannia, leaving something of a power vacuum. And that power vacuum was filled by invading Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, which brought over dialects that eventually became what we call English. And that's really where the textual record of British literature begins, in a way. So it really begins in the north of England, the part called Northumbria. So there's a few sort of moments that I'd like to talk about in this sort of 7th century flowering of culture, of textual culture in Northumbria. And the first is, if I don't know if you can see the little hand that I'm using my mouse with, but in the very north of this image of Northumbria, there's a little place called Lindisfarne. So what is Lindisfarne? Well, Lindisfarne was a place that there was a sort of island that was a little off the coast where the bunch of monks made a sort of monastery, an abbey, and sort of place of retreat. These are images of a later building constructed on the site after it was destroyed in raids and wars, but it gives you a sense of what it might have looked like in the 7th century when there was really a sort of cultural and literary flowering in this place. Now, one of the main sort of remnants of this flowering was just one of the most beautiful books of the Middle Ages, which is called the Lindisfarne Gospels. It's a manuscript and it's huge. We don't have the cover anymore. Incidentally, a bunch of Viking jerks came and probably ripped it off because it was encrusted in something like this, gold and silver and gems and stuff, threw the rest of the book into a ditch, which we have. So What this is the four Gospels and a bunch of sort of auxiliary texts, like these sort of table of contents things, that give you the concordances. And inside is just some of the most richly adorned and beautiful, and by the way, expensive art ever produced in the Middle Ages. I don't think I have the power to zoom in on any of this, but it goes deep. Very ornate Celtic knotwork. This is called a carpet page. It's just gorgeous, this thing. Every page has some secret little delight. It's sort of the Cadillac of medieval books. There's only one other book really like this. It's called the Book of Kells. It's very similar. So it has the Gospels in it. And what I wanted to focus on, in addition to the art, one more thing about the art, this famous Cairo page, you can see in this Celtic brooch from roughly the same era, just how much these two kinds of work, material and textual, bleed into each other and mutually influence. But what I wanted to talk about was something else that's there in this manuscript, and that is that a few hundred years after its creation in the 6th century, 7th century, another hand, the hand of an Anglo-Saxon, the hand of an English speaker, has glossed this text. So you can see it very minutely in between the larger letters, which are the Vulgate Latin. There are little, almost cursive letters. I should have definitely had sort of a zoom in here. But yeah, if you zoom in, and now I was going to have some other image up here, so this is going to take me a minute to reorganize here as I find the file that I was looking for. I'm not sure why this one quit on me. Let's see here. 18 pages. This is the one I wanted. If you can see here, above the words incipit evangelium, which means here begins the gospel, an English writer has written on ginnith godspell, which means the same thing. Here begins the good news. Here's one beginning of British literature. In the margins appears English for the first time, glossing a Latin text. This is where English literature in a way begins, in between the lines of a Latin text, in the margins as it were, eking out its existence in translation of a text that had immense influence and really, in a way, brought the ability for there to be texts at all to England. It's one thing that the Catholic Church did for Europe, if nothing else, was bring the textual technology wherever it went. And so English scrapes out its first inklings around this text and with its technology. That is the technology of writing. So this is one way in which the Northumbrian 7th century culture can qualify as something like a beginning of British literature. It's also a beginning of English literature in this sort of confluence of cultures, Latin and English, and they're trying to understand each other, or maybe I could say the English language trying to understand where it fits with respect to this immense cultural power that was the Catholic Church, the Vulgate Bible, and the textual culture in general. So that's one beginning of an answer. But there's another one. If you really want to talk about literature, I'm not sure if people would usually say that translation qualifies. Let's go back to that map for a minute. I want to talk about two men, and this gets directly to the reading that I assigned for the first day. Here's Lindisfarne up in the north. If you go down the coast, you'll come to a place called Jarrow, where there was another monastery, and there were two men associated with that over about 100 years that are very important for this question of where does British, where does English literature to begin. The first one I want to talk about was the latter one, the younger one. His name was Bede. He's usually called the Venerable Bede, and he wrote a history called the History of the Church of England, basically. And in that history, this is in the late 7th century. In that history, he tells the story, which you're going to read, about a guy named Cadmon, who is just sort of a lazy, ignorant shepherd who would go to these parties, these just regular eating festivals that were put on. It's a very Anglo-Saxon cultural item of going into a hall and eating and drinking together and singing together. So they passed around the harp, Bede tells us, and each person would sing a song in English maybe an epic tale, maybe something like Beowulf. And the harp would come to this guy Cadmon, this shepherd, and he didn't know how to sing. He sucked. He didn't know what to say. Apparently he couldn't sing very well, so he would just leave. So one night he leaves and he goes out and he sleeps while everybody else is in there partying and telling Anglo-Saxon tales, or maybe Geatish or Danish tales, and singing in Old English. He would go out and sleep. So one night, Bede says, an angel came to Caedmon and started like wrestling with him and telling him, you need to sing for me. And so after some hesitation, Caedmon says, fine, I'll sing for you. And he sings something. He sings something called Cadmans Hymn, which I've given you in several versions in this one document that I handed out. So there's several versions of this thing that's called Cadmans Hymn. It's what he apparently sang in response to this angel. So I'd like to spend some time talking about what this is. I don't have any images of it, but what's interesting about this is that Bede's work, which is in Latin, tells us what this means. That tells us what this poem means, but he doesn't give us the poem. This poem is usually considered the first, that is the oldest thing, the oldest poem written in Old English that we have. It's from somewhere between 1660 and 1684. We're not entirely sure about Caedmon's life, but he sang this song, and Bede, in his text that's written in Latin, gave a sort of Latin translation of it in prose. Later, in several of the manuscripts of this work, some other person went in and wrote out the Old English poem in the margins. So there again, Old English is sort of eking out its existence in the margin of a Latin text. What's interesting is that so this happened several times. One time, it was somebody from Northumbria who spoke in the northern dialect. That's what's to the left of me, over there at the moment. Later, in a different manuscript, a southern writer, a southern Englishman, wrote it the same poem, but in a different dialect, his dialect, the Wessex dialect, which is the one that's down there. And below me is a translation. You have this text at home. I'm going to talk about it for a little bit because it's a very great, very interesting little poem, and it is very likely the first, that is the oldest English poem we're going to have. So the version that's to the left here is the version that's probably in the closest thing to the dialect of Caedmon himself. I'm going to read it, and then we're going to talk about very briefly how it means what it means, and what an Old English poem does and how it works, because it's the same mechanics that you'll see playing out in Beowulf, or at least in the Old English version of Beowulf. I don't expect you to read that, but I might talk about it. So first I'm just going to read it out loud in what we think to be the right pronunciation. Here it goes. This, by the way, once again, is the Northumbrian version of Cadman's Hymn. Nu skullen herkan, hervan riches ward, Methodus machte and his modje dank. Werk wulder vader, swahi wundere was, eiti drikten orar stelde, her is skop, alda barnum, hebben til grove, halle scheppen. Tha midon gard, monken es ward, eiti drikten after teade, firm folde, freya, almechtig. So there you go. How we know how to pronounce that is another story for another day. But let's talk about how that poem means what it means. This is the Southern or Wessex dialect version of the poem, which I'm just going to look at because it's the one you're most likely to see. Let's go through this poem and talk a little bit about how it works. So, the basic metric of an Old English poem, Beowulf included, is that each line has two half lines, we can call them, and in those half lines there's a certain pattern of alliteration, that is the same starting sounds, that have to fall on stressed syllables. So here, and now I'm going to read in something like the Wessex dialect, Nu schulden herian, helvan riches ward, Methodus machte und his modje dank, werk wulder vader, swahe wundre je was, eche drichten or anstalde. So vowels, whatever vowel, alliterates with any other vowel. But the consonants have to be the same. They have to fall on stressed syllables. And there's a certain pattern of unstressed syllables that you would have as a poet to choose from in between. There's no rhyming. There's no set syllable length for the poem. Just a certain parameter of hitting these stressed syllables with alliterating sounds at the beginning of the words. So this poem means in a very different way than, say, a modern English poem would mean. We're going to go through it little by little to look at some of the ways that Old English language and poetry worked. So I'm translating this over here very literally to try to give you the flavor of it. So nu shula, now we should praise, now we have to praise the Lord of the kingdom of heaven, heaven Rik. It's like the Third Reich is the Rik, the kingdom of heavens, the guard or the ward of the kingdom of heaven. Methodus meachta, the measurer's power or the power of the measurer. And his, mode, it's basically the words for mood and think are compounded together to this modjethank, his mind thought or his intention. The intention, and his intention, the work of the Glory Father. So now you see, though, that sometimes it's helpful not to think of the words kind of flowing syntactically in a linear way. Old English is much more flexible than modern English in many ways. You can bounce around and you can kind of braid and embed things. So Swahi Wondrihuas, how he established, Oranstalda is how he established the beginning of whatever of wonders. Wondrihuas, or all wonders, as it kind of means. And now here we're going to name this person Echedrichten, Eternal Lord. Heeres Shop, first of all, he created Eordenbarnum, earth for the children, and heaven as a roof, Helvan Tarova, holy creating one, Hali Shipend. Then, Tha, afterward, after, he adorned Middle-earth. Theoda Midanyar. There's Middle-earth, by the way, famous from Tolkien. Tolkien usage as the name of his sort of planet, or the world. It's just the word for world, Middle-earth. We might get into why that is a little later. For now, I'll just let you wonder, why Middle-earth? What is it about our world that's makes sense to call it middle of what? Anywho. The guard, notice how this is so well braided together. We have three ways of naming God, braided together with the sentence about what this person's doing. Sort of an A-B, B-A, A-B structure. So the guard of mankind, Mon Kunis Ward, Eternal Lord, there's that again, Echedritten, Frey, Almighty, which is a very strange way to talk about the Christian God, which it definitely is about. Freya is the name of a Norse that is an old Germanic god, but the name has been sort of co-opted to be just another way of talking about God, the Christian God, I should say, which this poem's main sort of structural backbone is just names for God. Most of the poem, really, or about half of it, is taken up by just nouns that are substituting for the proper name of God, including this interesting phrase twice, Eche Drichten. Eche just means forever, eternal. Drichten is interesting because it is the word for an old, feudal, not feudal lord, it's pre-feudalism, excuse me, an old liege lord. Like the guy in Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, what's his name? Theoden, the guy who sort of runs the hall and a bunch of people are beholden to him. A Drichten is a guy who runs the drocht, which is, or a drucht, which is the court, the hall, the collection of warriors. So it's been sort of elevated by this adjective Eche to refer to the big lord, the big Drichten. A lot of the other words involved in qualifying this naming poem, this hemming poem, are time words. Now, Eche, which we talked about, or in the beginning, erist, first of all, in the beginning again, then Eche, after. So this poem is unfolding creation, pinning it on the Creator, and then sort of narrativizing this impossible sense of time in creation that was so fascinating to medieval poets. And then about the only other major component we haven't talked about are the verbs. There's one sort of thing becoming to us, according to this poem, shulon, which means we must. Herian. That's what we should do. We must praise. And then everything else this poem tells us is what he did, what the object of the praise did. He onstalda, he established, he skop, he shaped or created, and he teuda, he adorned. So this hymn is in praise of the Creator and his creation, and almost every word is intensely maximizing the power of that message. There's a few other things that I marked out here, but I really don't need to go into too much of this. I made this little slide thing for another class. So the odd man out of this poem, which Old English poems, when they're small, are often of a sort of 8-line sort. Not actually Old English poems, but really all Old Germanic poems too. So this Old English little micro hymn has this really strange last little line, which sort of folds into this very Christian vision. This one last sort of, I don't know what we would call it, synthesizing reference to something else that Cadmans Hymn, in a way, replaces. That is the old pagan faith, or at least it aims to replace. So what I always find so interesting about this story, and it's about the last thing I'll say about it before I say farewell, is that it's usually framed as the beginning of English literature. It's about the oldest English poem we have, and it's the story of somebody spontaneously coming up with a Christian hymn who wasn't able to sing before. But of course, if you remember what I was saying about the context of this poem, and if you read the little fragment of bead that I send out, there's reference in the story to English poetry before this poem. It's just not preserved. That is, what were they singing in that mead hall? What was everybody else singing? What were the stories they were telling? We'll never know, but they were telling something, they were singing something, and they were doing it in English. And Caedmon intentionally left that crowd. So the story of British literature is very complicated. And in just one version of an answer to that story, we already have a sort of internal paradox. That is, English literature begins as a sort of turning away from an earlier English literature, which is lost, as so much medieval literature is. Questions upon questions, which when answered just give us more questions. But I'll let you chew on this to think about, and if nothing else, just by looking at this poem, you're sort of giving yourself a little crash course in the poetics that will be so helpful, I think, when we come to read Beowulf on starting on Wednesday. So I'll be seeing you on live margin, and I'll look forward to our next visual encounter, though I don't encounter you. I'm kind of getting into this whole video thing. See you next time.